Thank you all for having me here. And I must admit I've only just been caught the last half of the panel beforehand, and I wish I had got it here earlier because I think the discussion is really, really important. And I wondered when I was putting this together where homelessness fits into this bigger, broader discussion. Do we actually have a discussion around homelessness being a gendered issue? And I don't think that we do. I don't think there's the knowledge and understanding around the community about what homelessness is as a wider definition, let alone the vulnerabilities that it brings. And that came out to light, I think, recently with the murder of the young woman in Melbourne. And just within the peak body trying to do the communications and responding to that day, trying to make some sense of what was going on and give it out to the communities about what this is happening. But we don't hear about it. So I really do appreciate having the chance to speak, and I think to this broader picture and a very passionate people who understand, because the challenge I had, one of the other challenges I had thinking about today is around prevention. And in the homelessness sector, we often don't talk about prevention because we're busy responding to people when they're there. So how do we look at prevention? How do we do that prevention space? And I was on the board of the Specialist Family Violence Service in Geelong for a while. And this was when the Royal Commission findings came out. And there was that debate happening then, is how do we talk about prevention when we don't even have the response, the adequate response being resourced? And so in the homelessness sector with family violence, we often then just resort straight to, well, that's what refuges are for. And we know that refuges don't do what they need to do. They are a quick solution for people who need it. But when we talk about homelessness, do we actually talk about it as a gendered issue? And is the housing and from where housing policies and where things are at and the vulnerabilities that leave people, do we speak that as a gendered issue? And I don't think as a community we do, and that's why it's really enlightening to come today and hear some of these voices. When I talk homelessness, most people ask me, how many people? So if I go to somewhere, it's how many people are homeless here? How many people are homeless there? And my first question is, well, who are you actually talking about? And when it's a public, and when I'm talking to other groups, there's obviously a fixation on people rough sleeping, which is, I think, they can understand how they're confronted with people rough sleeping every day and are shocked that this is still happening in the world we live in the society that we live in today, whether that's the case. And I think when we talk homelessness as being predominantly rough sleeping, we see the majority of people rough sleeping are male. Now, part of my role previous to this role was to work with a team of people to actually, when the census came around, to actually do the census count. It's actually come up with the figures for people experiencing homelessness through the census. And one of the things was people rough sleeping. So what we would do is we would have a short form, which is the back and front form, and we would go out and we would find people rough sleeping and we would ask them whether they can do the form. And majority they would say yes. I'm waking people up in the park and they would say yes. My feedback to the ABS and my feedback to the Australian Bureau of Statistics is that I don't think we are actually identifying, even to the point of women rough sleeping. Men that are rough sleeping tend to be much more in the open, much easier to locate, much easier to think. Women rough sleeping, we know, they're much more hidden. So we don't even understand, I don't think we even have a good understanding of what the figures and what the percentage and what the numbers we're actually talking about until something happens like the murder of the woman a couple of weeks ago. And then even then you can see where the conversation in the media and the community doesn't conjoin. It doesn't come around with what we know and what we'd expect to know. So when I talk even to that, so I won't ask because we don't have time today, but when I mention homelessness, most people go to the rough sleeping. And I think we can all relate, and I think we can all understand just the extra vulnerabilities that brings rough sleeping if you're female. And again, we only hear the stories occasionally. When we're in the work in the sector, we hear the stories that happen every day. We can appreciate that. But people rough sleeping only make up less than 10% of the homeless population. So 90% of the homeless population that we work with couch surfing, staying in inappropriate accommodation, etc. Much more hidden, much more difficult to reach for homeless services. And this is where, for prevention, we have to come back to the wider sector, to the community, to understand and appreciate that homelessness is a bigger problem than what we see in the street. One of the other data that does come out then is when we look at the census data, we see that when it comes out that the percentage of male to female people experiencing homelessness works out to be about 50-50. When we look at the homelessness service data, the majority of people coming to homeless services are women. And the majority of them have children coming with them. So when we start breaking this down, we can see that this is where the issue is, this is what we need to do, and we can appreciate, then go back to where the prevention, what is happening? Why is this the case? And the case is quite simply that homelessness happens because people don't have somewhere to live. So this is a breakdown of the housing system as we know it, and we all know that we hear in the media now a little bit about housing affordability, how that's creeping into our lives. But I still don't think we're getting to a point where we're breaking it down to what this means to women in our community. One of the focuses we have got at the moment that we would like to, well, it's always hard to discuss this about liking to emphasise, but one of the more shocking statistics we have at the moment is women over the age of 55 being our fastest increasing demographic in the homelessness sector. And I think when we put this out to community and to other sectors and say, well, why is this happening? What is happening here that women over the age of 55 are becoming homeless? And I think then we can start breaking down to what these causal effects are. And this is why I would have liked to have, I think, the conversations here over this morning and into tomorrow. What would be some of those causal effects of women over the age of 55 becoming homeless? This stems back to the system as we know it. Women over the age of 55, if their relationship breaks down, if their partner is deceased, don't have the superannuation, don't have the work background to be able to support a private rental as we know it. And the data and the statistics is quite simple. The report that came out recently to someone on a pension, if you look at the housing affordability across Victoria, there were 2 properties available for someone on a pension. And the demographic of women over the age of 55 becoming homeless has doubled within the census and the census before that. So it's something that we need to focus on, and I think it then goes back to what we were talking about, is around what are these structural causes. If we're going to look at prevention of homelessness, what are the structural causes that lead people to become homeless in the first place? This leads me to the intersect with family violence. And the intersect between homelessness and family violence services has always been very strong. There's over 30% of people coming to homelessness services have family violence as their primary cause of homelessness. So to neglect the housing, the affordable housing, for the options for people to go to, for people when the relationship breaks down, is what we need to discuss on a wider level. And it's what I hope you get from the next couple of days. When I talk about social housing, affordable housing being the option, the state that we've got to is that the estimate at the moment is we need 500,000 properties across Australia just to bring us up to a standard where we're able to effectively house people when they need it. So this goes right back to what we understand, to this gendered issue of housing and homelessness. And again, I'd really appreciate to see what comes out of the discussions over the next couple of days. We know, as I said before, the Family Violence Royal Commission did focus on this to a point. And there has been some really good outcomes because of that, a real focus on rapid rehousing for people, which is what we would promote as an effective response to homelessness. If people become homeless, then getting them housed in somewhere that's appropriate, affordable and stable is the best way for them to be able to manage what was going on with their lives. So I just want to draw attention to the Everybody's Home campaign that we're running at the moment. This is a national campaign around housing affordability. And I just want to finish by saying that providing more affordable social housing is the only practical and achievable way of making a housing market that works for everybody. And ultimately that makes women safer, now and into the future. Thank you.